There are certain women who can already feel that something in their life is rearranging itself, though nothing on the outside makes sense of it yet. Perhaps you are one of them. You have carried years that would have broken other people, and now in the quiet moments, strange little coincidences brush past you like invisible hands. A sentence overheard at the grocery store, a song at just the right moment, a dream that seems to answer a question you never dared to ask aloud. Jung would have called these synchronicities meaningful coincidences through which the unconscious begins to speak when the old story is no longer viable. They are not decorations. They are the first cracks in a life that has been held together by sheer will. Before the cracks appear, there is usually a long phase of apparent order. On the surface, the woman looks composed, competent, endlessly reliable. This is what Jung named the persona, the social mask, the carefully formed identity that allows us to function and be accepted in the world. For many women, especially those who had to be strong too, soon the persona hardens into a kind of armor. She is the one who shows up on time, pays the bills, remembers the birthdays, holds the family together, keeps the house, manages the crises, and never ever falls apart. If she does cry, she does it in the shower quietly where the water covers the sound. Inside that armor, however, something else is happening. The child who was once told to be strong, be good, don't make trouble, never had the luxury of being small. Her tears were inconvenient. Her fears were minimized. Somewhere along the way, she received a verdict: spoken or unspoken softness is dangerous, dependence is shameful, needing others is a liability. And so she learned to convert tenderness into efficiency, fear into productivity, grief into competence. The very energy that might have gone into play, desire, or creativity was harnessed to hold the structure of her life together. Jung understood the psyche as a self-regulating system. When consciousness leans too far in one direction, the unconscious compensates in the other. If the persona is built entirely around strength, self-sufficiency, and control, the unconscious will begin to generate the opposite: exhaustion dreams of collapse, fantasies of disappearing or being rescued, sudden tears that appear out of nowhere. This is not weakness. It is a profound inner intelligence trying to restore balance. But for the woman who has survived by being strong, these signals feel like threats. She tightens instead of loosening. She doubles down on responsibility. She becomes, in her own life, both the tireless worker and the merciless supervisor. Over time, this creates a split in her consciousness. Part of her is the performer, the one who does what must be done. Another part hovers slightly behind her eyes, watching. She sees herself carrying everything, hears herself saying, "It's fine, I've got it," while something deeper whispers, "I can't do this anymore." This inner observer is not just dissociation, it is also the first stirring of the self, as Jung described it, the organizing center of the psyche that is larger than the ego, the part of us that knows what we came here to become. The self watches as the persona grows more rigid, as the ego clings to its role as the strong one, and it patiently waits for the right moment to intervene. Often that intervention begins very gently. A conversation that lingers in her mind, a book that falls open to a certain passage, a dream of a house whose foundation is cracking, or of a child locked in a room. Symbolically, the unconscious is beginning to show her what she cannot yet admit: the structure is not sustainable, and the child within her has not disappeared. She has merely been exiled. These are early threshold moments, small but charged. If she ignores them, life will escalate. If she listens even a little, an invisible door begins to open. At this stage, she might not yet understand that she is approaching a liminal zone, a space between worlds. She only knows that something feels off. Things that used to motivate her no longer do. The praise she used to crave tastes flat. The heroic stories she told herself about being strong no longer soothe the ache in her chest. This is the beginning of the end of unconscious equilibrium, the quiet unraveling of a life organized around survival. The universe, through the language of the unconscious, is preparing to ask her a radical question: who are you when you are no longer the one holding up the sky? She does not step into the next phase willingly. Almost no one ever does. The liminal zone, this psychic in-between, often appears not as a mystical threshold, but as a slow erosion of what once felt solid. She wakes up tired even after sleep. Conversations she once tolerated now feel abrasive on her skin. A subtle loneliness grows not because she lacks people, but because she can no longer pretend that their expectations match the truth of who she is becoming. Jung described this stage as the withdrawal of libido from external structures, the psyche instinctively pulling energy inward in preparation for a descent. On the surface, it might look like burnout or detachment, but beneath that, in the deeper geological layers of the soul, something ancient is gathering strength. This gathering often begins with a collapse of orientation. What used to make sense no longer does. She notices contradictions she had once glossed over. The life she built feels like a house arranged for someone else. Even her own voice sounds foreign to her. This disorientation is not pathology. It is initiation. The old ego constructed around competence, duty, and survival can no longer carry the weight of her unlived life. There's a sense of approaching weather and inner pressure that cannot be ignored. Jung compared this to the onset of a neurosis, but not in the colloquial sense. Rather, neurosis is the psyche's attempt to correct an imbalance by forcing the individual inward to reclaim something essential. During this period, synchronicities intensify. The unconscious is speaking more loudly now. A woman who has always dismissed her intuition suddenly feels it sharpening. A phrase in a stranger's conversation startles her because it articulates a secret she never admitted. She dreams of descending staircases, wandering forests, unfinished basements, classic symbols of the underworld of the unconscious. The descent begins invisibly, long before she loses anything in the outer world. She begins to lose the illusion that she ever controlled her life through sheer effort. The first crack in the persona has become a widening fracture. Then, almost always, life delivers a precipitating blow. It might be a health scare that forces her to rest, or a betrayal that shatters her role as caretaker, or the quiet implosion of her own emotional endurance. Something breaks not to punish her, but because the ego has reached the edge of its architecture. Jung observed that when the persona becomes too dominant, the unconscious must dismantle it to prevent the psyche from suffocating under its own mask. For the woman who has been strong too long, this dismantling can feel like humiliation. She fears that she is losing her competence, her identity, her worth. In truth, she is losing only the mask. As the descent deepens, she enters what many mystic traditions call the night sea journey. This is not metaphorical sadness. It is the profound psychic stripping that occurs when the scaffolding of the old self falls away. Suddenly, she is face to face with the parts of herself she exiled decades ago, her anger, her longing, her fear, her erotic power, her need for nurture. These forces rise like tidal waters because the unconscious is no longer willing to remain silent. Jung called this encounter the shadow confrontation, the moment when everything she repressed in order to survive returns in its raw, original form. But before she can integrate these forces, she must pass through a deeper layer, the collective feminine lineage carried in her psyche. Many women who arrive at this stage dream of mothers and grandmothers, of barren landscapes, of weeping figures, or watchful female ancestors. These images are not sentimental. They are expressions of the collective unconscious, the vast psychic inheritance that flows through generations. In those dreams, she feels the weight of what her foremothers endured, the silences they swallowed, the desires they suppressed, the rage they buried. She realizes that much of her strength was not purely personal, it was ancestral. She has been carrying more than her own story. This realization often brings an ache so deep it vibrates in the bones. She begins to see that the pressures she placed on herself to be perfect, to be needed, to never falter, did not originate in her alone. They were the living residues of a lineage taught to survive by disappearing their own needs. In Jungian terms, she is confronting the cultural complex of the feminine, the inherited psychological patterns that shape how women see themselves and relate to power. These patterns now rise before her not to imprison her, but to be broken. And so the descent becomes both personal and archetypal. She is no longer merely a woman overwhelmed by life. She is Psyche, sorting the impossible seeds, Inanna crossing the gates of the underworld, Persephone approaching the dark that will remake her. Her suffering begins to feel strangely symbolic, as if she is undergoing a trial written long before she was born. This is the threshold where the personal unconscious opens into the collective. It is terrifying, but it is sacred. The deeper she descends, the more the landscape changes. Ordinary language loses its grip. Time becomes fluid. Days stretch and fold, nights thicken. She may move through her routines, but she feels as though she is walking underwater. This is the psychic underworld, an inner topology Jung described as the realm of the collective unconscious, where personal memories dissolve into archetypal currents. Here, she is no longer sustained by willpower logic or social roles. She is sustained only by an instinctual thread, the faint pulse of something within her that refuses to die. At first, she fears she is unraveling. She cries without knowing why. Rage erupts like lightning in a clear sky. Old wounds that she believed dealt with return with violent urgency. But this turbulence is not regression. It is a purification. The unconscious is now releasing the emotional material she suppressed while performing strength. What she once hid to survive is now rising to be integrated, not to destroy her, but to complete her. Jung described the shadow as everything the ego rejects or disowns. For the strong woman, this includes not only her grief and fear, but also her joy, creativity, erotic vitality, playfulness, qualities she sacrificed on the altar of responsibility. As she confronts the shadow, she discovers that it is not a singular entity, but a constellation. Her anger is a shadow. Her longing is a shadow. Her ambition, her desire for rest, her yearning to be held, these two are shadows because she labeled them forbidden. She sees that her identity as the strong one was built on a dismemberment. She severed parts of herself to meet the expectations placed upon her. Now the unconscious demands reassembly. This is why the descent feels like disintegration. It is not a collapse, but a dismantling of the false self. Dreams intensify during this phase. She might dream of wild animals, lions, wolves, serpents, symbols of instinctual power returning. She might dream of locked rooms opening or lost children being found. These images are not random. They are messages from the deeper self. Jung observed that the psyche communicates its intentions through symbolic imagery, guiding the individual toward wholeness. The woman descending now receives these images as if they are coordinates on a map she never knew she possessed. Sometimes the dreams horrify her. She dreams of fire, of drowning, of being chased or devoured. This does not mean she is in danger. It means she is approaching the instinctual core she once feared. The ego interprets these forces as threats because they are powerful enough to topple its carefully constructed identity. But the self is not trying to annihilate her. It is trying to release her from the prison of her own overdeveloped strength. During waking hours, she becomes acutely perceptive. She can sense the emotions beneath people's words. She detects dishonesty with uncanny clarity. She feels when someone is using her even if she cannot yet articulate it. This heightened perception is not paranoia. It is the result of having lived for years without anyone else to monitor the emotional environment. She became the lookout of her own life, and now that skill turns inward, illuminating every distortion in her psyche. This illumination, however, brings another confrontation, the father complex. The strong woman often built her strength as a defense against a masculine archetype, either embodied in an absent, critical, or emotionally unreachable father, or in a culture that rewarded self-sacrifice and punished dependency. Jung defined the father complex as an unconscious pattern in which the archetypal masculine authority structure, judgment, becomes entangled with personal history. As this complex rises, she sees how much of her identity was shaped around earning approval, avoiding punishment, or trying to prove her worth. She may have built her adult life around being beyond reproach, not realizing she was still negotiating with an internalized paternal judge. This recognition is devastating. She sees that much of her strength was a child's bargaining strategy. If I am good enough, strong enough, selfless enough, I will not be abandoned. But in the underworld, such strategies lose their power. She confronts the truth that no amount of perfection could have summoned the love she needed. This realization does not break her, it frees her. The father complex begins to dissolve, and with it, the compulsive need to earn legitimacy through suffering. As the complex loosens, something unexpected awakens. Beneath decades of vigilance, a force stirs that Jung called eros, not merely romantic longing, but the life force itself, the psychic principle of connectedness, creativity, and desire. It rises slowly, like warmth spreading through frozen limbs. She feels flickers of appetite, spiritual, emotional, sexual, creative, that she long denied. Eros is the antidote to the barren world she built through discipline. It invites her not to hold the world, but to participate in it. Yet Eros is frightening at first. To feel desire is to risk disappointment. To feel longing is to acknowledge need. To feel creative impulse is to admit she wants more than survival. The ego resists, it tightens, but the self persists. The self knows that Eros is the bridge out of the underworld, and so in this darkest stage, two forces coexist, the dissolution of the old self and the faint flickering emergence of a new one. She is no longer who she was, but not yet who she will become. This is the psychic chrysalis, the unbearable limbo at the center of every true transformation. If she can endure it without rushing to rebuild the mask, something extraordinary is preparing to be born. As Eros begins to move within her, tentatively like an animal sniffing the air after a long winter, the architecture of her inner world starts to shift. She notices small impulses that feel strangely new, the desire to rest without earning it, the urge to create without a purpose, the longing to be touched in ways that dissolve her vigilance. These impulses frighten her because they threaten the persona she has relied on for so long. But this is precisely their function. Eros destabilizes rigidity. It loosens the ego's defensive grip and prepares it to realign with the deeper self. Jung often wrote that libido, our psychic energy, must eventually be reclaimed from false attachments. The strong woman invested her libido for decades into duty performance and caretaking. Now the psyche demands a repatriation of that energy. This reclamation does not arrive as a polite request. It arrives as a pull, a yearning, a sudden sense that the life she's been living is too small to contain her. She may feel an inexplicable desire to move, to change something fundamental, to seek an intimacy she once dismissed, or to withdraw completely from relationships that no longer nourish her. These stirrings are not whims. They are the self using eros to guide the ego toward expansion, but before expansion, contraction. The psyche tightens around unresolved wounds that must be integrated before she can emerge whole. The shadow material intensifies, not to torment her, but because she can now bear to see what was previously unbearable. She might feel waves of exhaustion so deep they seem geological, as if her bones are remembering every year she pushed herself beyond human limits. Grief rises from the unconscious in thick wordless currents. Rage surfaces with volcanic force, startling her with its purity. This is not emotional chaos. This is the release of psychic tension accumulated over a lifetime. And then, something subtle shifts. The grief stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like truth. The rage stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like a boundary awakening. The exhaustion stops feeling like failure and becomes evidence that her body is finally telling the truth. This moment, the willingness to feel what she could not feel before, is the core of the descent. The shadow is no longer an enemy, it becomes a repository of lost vitality. She begins to reclaim the parts of herself she once discarded to survive. In this stage, she often discovers the feminine lineage moving through her with new clarity. She sees her mother not just as the person who raised her, but as a woman shaped by her own wounds, silences, and sacrifices. She senses her grandmother's unspoken longing in her own chest. She recognizes patterns of abandonment, overwork, emotional stoicism, or self-erasure that have echoed through generations. This is where the mythic dimension enters fully. She is no longer just confronting her personal history. She is metabolizing a collective inheritance. The psyche entrusted her with a generational task to break a cycle that her ancestors endured but could not transform. This realization fills her with both grief and strength. She feels the weight of what she carries, but also the magnitude of what she is capable of healing. Jung taught that individuation is never a purely personal journey. When one person integrates what has been split for generations, the entire lineage shifts. The unconscious, in its vast intelligence, chooses individuals who carry both the burden and the capacity to transmute it. She begins to sense that her suffering was not meaningless, it was initiatory. As she integrates more of her inner world, her outer world begins to reorganize. People react to her differently. Some step back without explanation. Others are drawn toward her with a reverence they cannot name. This is not magic. It is resonance. The psyche broadcasts its new alignment outward. She is less easily manipulated, less susceptible to guilt, less willing to contort herself to keep the peace. Her boundaries sharpen not out of defensiveness, but out of clarity. She finally sees that giving without depletion is possible only when the self, not the persona, is in charge. And then comes the quiet but seismic shift. She no longer feels the need to be chosen. Approval loses its currency. The gaze of others no longer defines her. The father complex loosens further, and with it the old compulsions to earn love through suffering performance or self-abandonment. She begins to choose herself with a steadiness that surprises her. This is the beginning of the ascent, not back to who she was, but toward who she is becoming. As the ascent begins, it does so quietly that she may not realize at first that she is rising. There is no triumphal music, no blazing revelation. Instead, there is a softening. The air around her feels less dense. The world, which once pressed against her like a heavy wall, becomes permeable. Something inside her long imprisoned exhales. This is the moment in individuation when the ego stops fighting the self and begins to move in rhythm with it. The tension of opposition dissolves, a deeper coherence forms. She notices herself doing small, radical things. She says no without panicking. She says yes without overthinking. She rests without guilt, speaks without rehearsing, feels without collapsing. These subtle acts signal a monumental shift. She is no longer organizing her life around fear. The father complex, once the source of her internal judge, has receded. Its architecture no longer defines her choices. She relates to authority, outer and inner, from a place of equilibrium rather than appeasement. Jung would say she has reclaimed her inner masculine in its healthy form structure, without tyranny, discernment, without shame, clarity, without domination. From this new center, Eros flows freely, not as romantic longing, not as dependency, but as a creative animating current. She feels impulses to write, move, paint, rest, reimagine her life. She feels drawn to beauty with a hunger she had once suppressed. She may find herself laughing more, noticing the sky, craving touch, craving space, craving growth. This is libido returning to its rightful owner. The psychic energy that once held her persona in place is now available for life itself. But this ascent is not merely personal. Something archetypal moves through her. She becomes aware of the feminine principle in a way that is neither sentimental nor ideological, but experiential. She senses the ancient lineage of women who descended before her, Inanna, rising from the underworld crowned in new authority, Persephone, emerging with the knowledge of both realms, Psyche, returning from her impossible tasks with a soul strengthened beyond innocence. She recognizes that her journey mirrors theirs not metaphorically, but structurally. The unconscious follows ancient patterns because the soul grows the way seeds sprout through laws older than culture. As she rises, synchronicities return not as warnings or disruptions, but as alignments. Doors open with minimal effort. People arrive who meet her with respect rather than extraction. Opportunities appear that match her inner reality instead of her old identity. It is as if the universe recalibrates itself around her new frequency. Jung insisted that the psyche and the world are not separate. What changes internally radiates outward. And the woman who has integrated her shadow, reclaimed her eros, and restructured her complexes does not return to an unchanged environment. Reality itself shifts to meet her. There is sovereignty now. Not the brittle independence she once wore like armor, but an inner solidity that does not require performance. She feels alone sometimes, but not lonely. Solitude becomes spacious rather than suffocating. She enjoys her own company. She trusts her perceptions. She understands her intuition as a function of deep psychic literacy rather than a mysterious glitch. She can receive care without collapsing into dependence and give care without dissolving into depletion. This balance is the signature of individuation. Inevitably, she grieves. She grieves the years spent holding the world together, the softness she had to hide, the terror she carried alone, the unlived desires that waited in the dark. She grieves for the version of herself who believed that strength was the price of worthiness. This grief is not a setback, it is a blessing. It softens what the journey hardened, it completes what the descent initiated. Grief is the final baptism before rebirth. And then one day, usually in an ordinary moment, she realizes something profound. She is no longer searching for herself. She has become herself. The self, the vast organizing center of her psyche, feels near accessible familiar. She no longer wonders whether she is enough, she simply is. This is the quiet revolution at the heart of individuation, an unshakable intimacy with one's own being. She emerges not as the strong woman the world once demanded, nor as the collapsed woman she feared becoming, but as a sovereign woman who carries both strength and softness without contradiction. A woman who can meet her own gaze without flinching, who can walk into her future without abandoning her past, who can hold the world without losing herself and release the world without losing her purpose. And in this final realization, she encounters a truth that belongs not just to her, but to every woman who has walked the long road of psychic transformation. The self does not ask you to become more than you are. It asks you to become fully what you already are. If this journey resonates with your own inner landscape, if you feel the echoes of your own descent and emergence within these words, I invite you to stay with this exploration. Like, share, or comment with the insight that changed you most. And if you wish to continue diving into these hidden corridors of the psyche of myth-depth psychology and the feminine soul, subscribe and walk with us a little farther.